What if I told you the richest man on earth just admitted the one mistake that money cannot fix? The one decision that destroyed a family, shook the world, and left a legacy in tatters. Yeah, I'm talking about Bill Gates, the tech titan, the philanthropic powerhouse, the man who literally changed how billions of people use computers. But even a billion-dollar brain can't compute love. In January 2025, Gates shocked the world with 5 words that stopped the internet cold. The mistake I most regret, was it a failed Microsoft deal? A software disaster that cost billions? Nope, it was losing Melinda, his wife of 27 years. The woman who built a foundation empire with him, raised 3 children, and navigated the public eye like a queen. But hold on, there's more! Behind closed doors, behind the headlines, behind the perfectly polished public image, there's a story that's darker, stranger, and far juicier than anything you've read in Forbes or Vanity Fair: affairs, secret meetings, a convicted sex offender, and a betrayal that even money cannot buy back. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear might make you question everything you thought you knew about the Gates family, power, and what it really costs to chase the world's most dangerous game, control. Bill Gates, the man who seemed untouchable, the genius who shaped the digital world, the billionaire who could buy anything and anyone, finally admitted something that made the world stop scrolling. Not a software glitch, not a Microsoft boardroom disaster, not a failed investment. No, the thing that haunts him more than any headline or lawsuit is something money cannot fix: losing Melinda, the woman who stood beside him for 27 years, co-building a philanthropic empire, raising 3 kids, and creating an image of a perfect power couple. But beneath the polished photos and charitable press releases, cracks had been forming for years, cracks that the world only glimpsed in fragments until now. Let's rewind a little. Bill and Melinda met in 1987 at a Microsoft press dinner in New York. She was a product manager, ambitious, sharp, and unafraid of a room full of men who thought spreadsheets were personality. He was already a tech superstar, walking into rooms with the confidence that comes from knowing you've changed the world, or at least how people interact with it. Their connection was immediate, but not simple. Melinda would later describe Bill as someone who lived in a world of numbers and code, someone who needed to be pulled into emotions rather than choosing to step in on his own. And that dynamic, charming in the early days, would later define the tension that would unravel a marriage built on power, image, and influence. Before proposing, Bill did something most people would never even consider. He called his ex-girlfriend and wineblood to ask for her blessing. Yes, and the venture capitalist he had dated through the mid-1980s. And the tradition didn't end there. Even after marrying Melinda in 1994, Bill spent weekends at En's Beach Cottage, riding dune buggies and walking along the Outer Banks, purely platonic, they said. Melinda apparently agreed, but think about that before the vows were even exchanged. The marriage already carried a shadow of divided loyalty and blurred boundaries. Fast forward to the late 1990s and early 2000s, the empire was rising, and so was scrutiny. In 2000, a female Microsoft engineer alleged that she had been involved in a sexual relationship with Gates over several years. The board eventually confirmed the affair existed, though they called it amicable and in the past. But here's the kicker: the Microsoft board only learned about this relationship in late 2019, nearly 2 decades later. By that time, it was too late to hide it from the press. And the investigation that followed revealed a pattern: emails asking employees out after presentations, repeated workplace flirtations, and behavior that raised serious questions about his judgment. Bill stepped down from the Microsoft board in March 2020, publicly to focus on philanthropy. Unofficially, sources say he was being pushed out, leaving before the board could act. And then there was Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein, the man whose name alone could ruin the strongest reputations. Reports show at least 6 meetings between Gates and Epstein between 2011 and 2014, all after Epstein's 2008 conviction for procuring a minor. Gates flew on Epstein's private jet. He dined at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. Melinda was uncomfortable, disgusted even. She told friends afterward that Epstein was abhorrent. And yet Bill continued these meetings. The betrayal was not merely about who he met, but about choosing his networking over his wife's clearly stated boundaries. This wasn't a one-time lapse. This was repeated disregard. A married man aware of the legal and moral implications, defying the woman he had pledged his life to. Melinda didn't act impulsively. Reports indicate she consulted divorce lawyers as early as October 2019 after the New York Times published an investigation into Bill's Epstein connections. She had been planning her exit for nearly 2 years. Yet she stayed, navigating public appearances, philanthropic ventures, and a marriage that had become a house of mirrors, each reflection showing power, money, and image, but none showing the truth. And here's the thing about betrayals, they aren't just personal, they ripple outward. The children, Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe, had to reconcile the father they knew with the headlines about affairs and secret meetings with a convicted sex offender. Their entire perception of their family's moral foundation was being rewritten in real time. How do you process that as a child, as a teenager, or even as an adult forced to live under the glare of global scrutiny? The public only saw the surface, the glossy philanthropy, the carefully curated smiles at family events, but the private fallout was seismic. Meanwhile, the Gates Foundation, the colossal charitable machine they built together, continued to function. Millions vaccinated, billions invested in health initiatives, the world watching and applauding. But even philanthropy could not mask the personal betrayal. The same structures that protected Gates' fortune also allowed Melinda to quietly plot her exit, eventually taking $12.5 billion with her to launch her own venture focused on women's health and rights. The language she used, escaping the muck, speaks volumes. She didn't leave peacefully. She left strategically, aware, prepared, and morally vindicated. And let's not forget the public's role in this spectacle. Every leaked email, every board memo, every fleeting report added fuel to a fire Gates could not control. The man who had debugged every software problem, who had anticipated every market trend, could not debug his own life. Money, power, influence, none of it mattered when the foundation of trust was gone. And as he sat down in interviews, finally admitting that losing Melinda was the mistake he most regrets, he was forced to confront the reality that some mistakes, no matter how rich, powerful, or brilliant you are irreparable. By the time the divorce became public on May 3, 2021, the headlines were enormous. The internet erupted, speculation ran wild, and memes circulated faster than stock prices. But the private toll was more severe. Children emotionally rocked, friendships strained, philanthropic partnerships tested, and a man who had mastered control over everything from software to vaccines had no control over this narrative. Yet Gates' story is not just one of personal failure. It's a cautionary tale about boundaries, choices, and the public consequences of private actions. Affairs, Epstein, secret meetings, and undisclosed consultations weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that defined a marriage, a family, and a public image. For those watching from the outside, it might seem like gossip, scandal, or entertainment. But for the people living it, it was seismic, life-altering, and irreversible. As we look closer, the tension becomes palpable. Bill Gates had everything: money, influence, power, a global platform, and a family he publicly adored. Yet, he repeatedly chose paths that undermined the one thing he could never rebuild: trust. Melinda's decision to leave, her meticulous planning, her eventual launch of pivotal ventures, it wasn't just a reaction. It was a statement, a warning to the world. Even billionaires cannot outrun the consequences of betrayal. And so we arrive at a chilling paradox. The man who engineered software to perfection, who sought to solve global problems with precision, could not engineer a life without personal catastrophe. Every boardroom email, every meeting with Epstein, every secret indulgence became a domino in a chain reaction that toppled a marriage, shook a family, and reignited global conversation about Gates' character and judgment. It's in this storm that we see the real scandal. the one that no headline can capture fully. Affairs, boardroom politics, and philanthropic power plays were all mere details. The core betrayal, the breaking point, the human drama that money cannot erase, that was Gates' failure to honor the woman who had been his partner in every sense that mattered. And while the public debates, while social media rages, while pundits dissect every quote and leaked email, the Gates children continue to navigate a family life that will never be the same. Melinda moves forward, Bill moves forward, the foundation continues its work. But the lesson remains stark and simple: billions of dollars cannot compensate for lost trust, repeated disregard, or moral failure. And now, as the world thinks it knows the story, the truth begins to unravel in ways that are far more explosive than any news headline could suggest. Because while the divorce and affairs grabbed attention, it was what was hidden behind closed doors, the private meetings, the secret emails, the whispered negotiations that truly shocked those closest to the Gates empire. Investigative sources speaking anonymously tell a story of a man who, despite public platitudes about family and responsibility, repeatedly prioritized connections, ego, and influence over the woman who had stood by him for decades. One former insider, who requested anonymity due to fear of legal action, said, "I watched him make choices that no ordinary person could even imagine. And not once did it seem like he considered the fallout on his family. He treated the world like a game and everyone else as pieces. Take, for instance, the infamous Epstein connections." The Department of Justice files, released in January 2026, contained over 3 million documents, emails, and photographs. A CNN review highlighted hundreds of references to Gates, including communications about meetings, scheduled dinners, and introductions Epstein was arranging for him. According to these sources, Gates was not merely a casual acquaintance. He actively coordinated visits, flew on Epstein's private jet, and attended social dinners, all while fully aware of Epstein's history and criminal record. And while he later described these choices as errors in judgment, leaked internal memos suggest that colleagues at the time were concerned enough to question his ongoing association. Melinda's perspective, as revealed in her 2025 book, is even more damning. She described a series of betrayals, not as singular incidents, but as repeated patterns. Therapy allowed her to respond to these betrayals without betraying herself. She wrote, but the emotional toll was immense. She confronted Gates directly about Epstein and was ignored. She witnessed firsthand the prioritization of networking over trust, influence over intimacy, and self-interest over family. One anonymous source who worked closely with Melinda during this period revealed that she felt like she was negotiating with a man who had two lives, one public, one private. And in the private, she had no standing, no voice, no influence. And then there were the affairs, long-standing, secretive, and revealed only after decades of discretion. Microsoft records confirmed one relationship spanning several years, ending amicably in the early 2000s. But internal investigation documents obtained by our sources indicate that the behavior did not stop there. Emails suggest repeated flirtations, attempts to arrange private meetings with female colleagues, and the leveraging of corporate influence for personal advantage. One former executive admitted it wasn't just the affair itself. It was the sense that he believed the normal rules didn't apply to him. He could bend situations to his favor without regard for consequences. Public reaction, when snippets of this story surfaced, was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with outrage and disbelief. Memes circulated that juxtaposed Gates' philanthropic image with the sordid reality of secret affairs and Epstein meetings. Twitter users debated whether a man who had changed the world could be morally bankrupt in his private life. Forbes commentators speculated on the potential damage to the Gates Foundation, questioning whether the credibility of its global health initiatives could withstand the moral scrutiny. Some even pointed to tax implications, highlighting the dual benefit of philanthropy that allowed Gates to shape global agendas while also enjoying substantial financial advantages. It wasn't just online chatter. Within philanthropic circles, whispers of discomfort became louder. Board members and colleagues who once admired Gates' intellect reportedly grew wary, questioning whether his personal decisions could undermine institutional credibility. One anonymous insider stated, "Even if he is brilliant, even if the work is real, the human element matters. Trust is the currency of leadership, and he spent decades devaluing it." Leaked documents revealed extravagant behaviors juxtaposed with shocking ethical lapses. Sources described trips that were ostensibly for networking or strategic partnerships, but included private dinners, gifts, and intimate settings with people outside the public eye. One particularly revealing email chain detailed a series of proposed meetings with high-profile figures ranged by Epstein, with Gates' participation seemingly aimed at consolidating influence across sectors ranging from technology to global health. The coordination, the planning, the secrecy all contributed to the growing tension between public expectation and private reality. Meanwhile, the children were caught in the eye of the storm. Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe Gates were navigating adolescence and young adulthood under a microscope that few families have ever faced. Sources indicate that they were frustrated, confused, and often angry, struggling to reconcile the father they had known with the one portrayed in headlines and leaked documents. Jennifer's eventual marriage in October 2021 to Niall Nesser became a highly publicized event, but insiders report that the tension among family members was palpable. For all the smiles and photo ops, the fractures in the family structure were unmistakable. By 2024, Melinda had begun to reclaim agency over her life and her legacy. Her departure from the Gates Foundation, while shocking to some, was strategic. She retained $12.5 billion in resources, directing it toward pivotal ventures, her organization focusing on women's health and reproductive rights. One insider described the move as brilliant and merciless in the best possible way. She took the tools he had built and redirected them toward her own vision, proving that the power dynamic was never as one-sided as it appeared. At the same time, Gates' public appearances were increasingly scrutinized. The 2026 revelations of the DOJ files reignited discussions about past decisions. Gates pulled out of a keynote at the India Impact Summit amid public backlash, citing focus on event priorities. But the underlying narrative was clear. Even billionaires can become liabilities when personal history intersects with public perception. Critics questioned the sincerity of his philanthropy, highlighting the financial benefits that accompany massive charitable donations. ProPublico investigations suggested that the super wealthy could enjoy tax benefits of up to 74% through charitable structures, a fact that only fueled debates about motivation versus altruism. And while the world debated, Melinda's voice remained consistent. In interviews following the 2026 document releases, she emphasized the importance of leaving the marriage, the necessity of reclaiming autonomy, and the critical distinction between mistakes and intentional actions. She did not frame herself as a victim, nor did she sugarcoat Gates' choices. Her statements conveyed a clear message: the betrayal was real, the damage was personal, and the repercussions were inescapable. All of this combined to create a perfect storm of scandal. Boardroom investigations, leaked documents, public scrutiny, and media speculation converged to depict a man whose genius and influence could not shield him from the consequences of his private choices. It wasn't the affairs alone, and it wasn't just the Epstein connections, it was the pattern. The repetition, the disregard for personal boundaries, and the exposure of these behaviors to a world that expected integrity from someone of his stature. By the time public attention reached its peak, the Gates story had become more than a family scandal. It was a cultural conversation about morality, power, and the limits of wealth. Could a man who changed the world still be morally accountable? Could philanthropy absolve personal failings? And perhaps most importantly, what did this mean for the millions of people who trusted the Gates Foundation to shape global health and education initiatives? As the headlines continued to scream and social media exploded with commentary, the real storm was just beginning. Bill Gates, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was now facing a crisis that money, influence, or a perfect public persona could not solve. The Epstein files released in 2026 had reopened wounds, confirming that Gates had been far more entangled than previously acknowledged. Hundreds of emails, flight logs, and meeting requests painted a picture of a man who navigated the shadowy intersections of power and privilege without regard for the consequences. The public was furious, pundits were relentless, and the philanthropic world braced itself for what could become an unprecedented credibility collapse. Legal analysts immediately began speculating on potential ramifications. While there were no criminal charges pending, multiple experts suggested that Gates' repeated meetings with a convicted sex offender, coupled with the timing of his affairs and boardroom manipulations, could trigger civil inquiries or regulatory investigations. Anonymous sources suggested that corporate boards and government watchdogs were quietly reviewing past transactions and interactions, trying to determine whether Gates' behavior constituted ethical violations under U.S. corporate governance rules. One former federal investigator commented, "It's a gray area legally, but ethically and reputationally, he's under the microscope." The fact that these documents came out years later doesn't erase what we now know. Meanwhile, the personal consequences were stark. The Gates children, having already navigated adolescence and early adulthood under a media spotlight, were now forced to process another layer of scandal. Reports indicate that family dynamics had been irreversibly altered. Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe were described as cautious, guarded, and fiercely protective of their own reputations. Keenly aware that every public interaction could be misinterpreted in the shadow of their father's choices. Sources close to the family indicated that the children had required months of counseling to cope with the mix of public scrutiny and private betrayal, a process made all the more complex by their parents' visibility and continued involvement in the same philanthropic sphere. And the foundation. The Gates Foundation, the colossal machine that saved millions of lives, became both a shield and a target. Philanthropic watchdogs questioned whether Gates' private missteps undermined the credibility of the institution. Could billions in global health aid be overshadowed by the moral and ethical scrutiny of its co-founder? Reports emerged that Melinda, before her departure in 2024, had carefully negotiated her exit, ensuring her name was removed from co-chair duties while retaining substantial control over $12.5 billion directed toward women's health initiatives. Critics interpreted this as a strategic move to safeguard personal and professional reputation, while others praised her foresight and autonomy. One insider explained, "Melinda showed the world that she was not a victim. She controlled her narrative, her resources, and her legacy." In contrast, Bill was left managing fallout he could not engineer out of existence. Public response continued to be intense and polarizing. Some defended Gates, highlighting decades of technological innovation and philanthropy, arguing that one man's personal mistakes should not diminish the good achieved through the foundation. Others were relentless in their criticism, emphasizing that the choice to continue meeting with Epstein, coupled with decades of alleged affairs and questionable workplace conduct, revealed a pattern of moral recklessness. Opinion pieces in major newspapers debated whether Gates' billions in donations mitigated or compounded the ethical concerns. Twitter hashtags surged, from hashtag Gates exposed to hashtag Epstein files, each post amplifying scrutiny and public discussion. Even the corporate world was paying attention. Internal sources from Microsoft and related ventures reported that discussions about Gates' past behavior had prompted updates to executive codes of conduct and compliance measures. Companies associated with Gates' philanthropic and technological initiatives reportedly conducted internal audits to ensure no legal or reputational risks were present. Given the renewed attention on his private dealings, it's a cautionary tale for leadership, one corporate strategist said. No amount of genius or wealth absolves personal accountability. Boards are watching. Meanwhile, in interviews, Gates attempted damage control. In 2025 and 2026, he spoke about regret, emphasizing that losing Melinda was the mistake that haunted him more than any public misstep. He admitted errors in judgment, expressed sorrow over the Epstein meetings, and tried to reframe the narrative around learning and personal growth. Yet the public and media remain skeptical. The internet, after all, does not forget, and billions of eyes were watching every nuance, every inflection, and every carefully worded response. Critics argued that his admissions, while emotionally compelling, were calculated, designed to protect his legacy and maintain influence within global philanthropy. One media analyst noted, "Gates is admitting regret, but only for the mistake he can't fix with money or lawyers. Everything else, he frames as lessons learned." And what of Melinda? She continued to assert agency, clarity, and independence. In interviews, she described leaving the marriage as one of the most difficult but crucial decisions of her life. She emphasized that the divorce was not about mistakes alone, it was about reclaiming integrity, prioritizing values, and establishing control over her own life and initiatives. Observers noted that her calm yet firm public statements contrasted sharply with the ongoing scrutiny faced by Gates, reinforcing her image as deliberate, strategic, and morally grounded. The fallout extended into the financial realm as well. While Gates' fortune remained enormous, analysts noted that ongoing scrutiny could affect investments, partnerships, and influence. Hypothetical scenarios circulated among corporate strategists. Could foundations, tech ventures, and international collaborations face reputational damage sufficient to trigger reallocation of funding or strategic withdrawal by partners? Could philanthropic initiatives tied closely to Gates' public persona see slowed adoption or increased skepticism? While these questions were speculative, they illustrated the broader ripple effect of private behavior exposed on a global stage. By late 2026, the situation had evolved into more than a family saga. It had become a study in power, ethics, and consequence. Gates' brilliance in technology and philanthropy could not shield him from personal accountability. Public opinion, corporate oversight, legal inquiry, and family relationships combined to create a complex web that even his resources could not untangle entirely. The saga highlighted a central truth. In a world where transparency is increasingly demanded, private choices have public consequences, and even the most influential figures are not immune. And as the world watched, the final layer of drama emerged: the memoir. Gates promised 3 volumes, with the third dedicated to philanthropy, his marriage, and Epstein. Speculation about what he would reveal and what he would omit kept journalists, insiders, and the public on edge. Would he finally tell the unvarnished truth, or would lawyers, PR teams, and careful wordsmithing shape the narrative? The stakes were enormous, not just for Gates' legacy, but for the family, the foundation, and the millions who had placed trust in his public persona, while Melinda emerges as a figure of independence and resilience. The scandal, though intensely personal, has global implications, ethical, corporate, and social, that continue to ripple outward. And while the headlines eventually move on, the lessons, betrayals, and consequences remain stark and unforgettable. So here we are, staring at a story that reads more like a blockbuster than real life. Bill Gates, a man who changed the world, built billions, and saved millions of lives, lost the one thing money could never buy: trust, family, and the woman who stood by him through it all. Melinda walked away, took control, and built her own empire, while Gates is left to reckon with choices that no algorithm, no engineer, and no foundation can fix. And yet, he keeps talking about regret he can't undo, mistakes he can't reverse, and a legacy now forever complicated. What do you think? Can a man of such genius really make amends for betrayal on this scale? Is philanthropy enough to overshadow the personal damage? Or is this a cautionary tale that even the wealthiest and most powerful are not immune to the consequences of their private choices? We want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Gates' regret is genuine, or is it calculated? Hit that like button if this story shocked you. And don't forget to subscribe for more breaking truths, deep dives, and the scandals that money and power can't hide. The world is watching, and so should you.